Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Terry. That's a hard act to follow. There's a, that's all right. I want to slightly disagree with Terry on the legal part. What socially responsible investing is really two things. For individuals, socially responsible investing is simply the incorporation in the investment decision-making process of the individual's values, religious, social, cultural, ethical. That's all it is. Incorporating what you wish to stand for into your investment decision-making process. Note that it's an incorporation, not substitution. It's part of the discipline people should go through in evaluating how you're going to invest your money. That's with individuals. There's a second aspect to this which makes the question of legality an important one, and that is institutional investors. The Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility was set up by mainline religious institutions, mainly Catholic and old line Protestant. These were institutions which had incorporated typically their values in their investment decision-making process to one degree or another. There was a huge debate as to whether institutions could incorporate these values without violating, as trustees, their fiduciary responsibility. Now, if you really, I'll give you a legal tip here. If you really want, as a lawyer, to scare the wits out of any trustee, all you have to do is say fiduciary. They haven't got a clue what it means, but they know it's trouble. So there have been rafts of articles in the law journals about socially responsible investing. They divide about 50-50 in terms of whether you can do this as a trustee or as a fiduciary or you can't. And there are certain types of trustees who absolutely can't do this. So it's important to understand there is a difference here between individual investors and various types of institutional investors. This is a complicated area, and one of the things that's happened over the 35 to 40 years of modern social investment is that it's become complicated. The way I got started formally into social investing is we decided that we wanted to answer a typical trustee and advisor question, and that was, if you are going to invest with your principals, obviously you've got to give up performance. So how much is it going to cost you to invest with your principals? No one in 1988, and I want to emphasize this, no one in 1988 thought that you could invest with social principles and not give up some performance. Let me emphasize that. No one. It was...
Even you.
Maybe. But so the purpose of setting up the Domini Index was to find out how much this would cost. What were the costs of social investing? We were more than slightly stunned to find out with the first run of companies that it outperformed the S&P over the trial period. That was a stunning result, and one that we actually went back and retested, looking to lose money. How do we get there? We had to research a universe of companies that represented, or that would represent, the universe that social investors would buy. So how did we determine what social investors would buy? What we did was we did a lot of talking. We did a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of interviewing. And we did a hell of a lot of research. to try to come up with what a typical social investor would buy. That is still how mutual funds in the SRI space evaluate their market and how they establish their benchmarks. But we found out something else in this process, and it's important to understand that we didn't start out to be a research firm. We started out to be an index. We were looking at indexes, not at research. But in the process of building these indexes, we discovered that the kinds of indicators that social investors looked at provided insights into a corporate culture that had, in our view, the elements of predictability. You could see the patterns of corporate behavior from looking at how corporations dealt with their environmental issues, for example, or how they dealt with labor problems. In one sense, these are issues of character. They are issues of culture. And that culture, as Cary will talk about, has implications for performance, for financial performance. So that is the origins of the research that now underlies a very large industry, probably representing, 12–13% of investable assets in the United States today. And with that, rather than try to filibuster, I'll turn this over to Cary.
Actually, we're going to go to Casey. Thank you, Peter.
Go to my left.
Thanks. I want to jump in here to bring in the shareholder activism aspect of the roots of SRI, because what you've heard is the investor side of creating this experience that we now just said is 10, 12, and growing % of investable assets. It is certainly important to think about how one wants to invest their money in advance, but sometimes you find yourself with money invested and you want to make sure that who you have it invested with is meeting your values. And so you kind of come at this in a couple of different ways. The activism side of things comes at it that second way. Let me put a point there for a moment and say this. I share some gray hairs with the rest of the folks on this panel, but their histories are different than mine, as you heard in Anders' introduction. I do not come from the finance background. I come from the commoner background, if you will, that is to say the advocacy side of the equation. I raise that for this reason. One of the things that still needs to be worked on in terms of our SRI future is how we diversify who's in this investment game. As a Black American, very few of us are statistically involved in investments, other than through mutual funds, which is mostly through employers with 401ks. So we've got to, and there's no apologies for coming into this world from a advocacy avenue. I'm just saying that ought not be as prominent an avenue for so many Americans when there are other Americans who come into the investment world through a different route. So that's one of the things that has to be worked on. That said, the value of the emotive approach to solid investments that are socially responsible has very early roots. Earlier than, I think Anders in his introduction said activism started before any of us who are here in this room or something to that effect. Indeed, the sense of moral purpose is a core part of the human experience. Henry David Thoreau says that goodness is the only investment that never fails. And I think it is on that foundation, if you will, that socially responsible activism in the form of shareholder activism, but even otherwise, is rooted. It is in the goodness of us as human beings that we simply want our values to be represented in every aspect of who we are. So in 1758, the Philadelphia Quakers prohibited their members from having anything to do with the slave trade. That was socially responsible activism. In the 1950s and the 1960s, labor unions began to realize that there was some strength that they could muster by acting as a union does, implicit in the name, to try to influence proxy votes around issues related to the use of pension funds. The 1960s and the 1970s launched the so-called modern era of activism. For some of us who were around in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I don't know whether that's modern anymore or not, but there was a lot going on during that period of time. And so what I'm about to say is just a reminder to all of us so that we can sort of put this into a basic frame. The civil rights movement was occurring at that time, and as part of the movement, part of Dr. King's particular effectiveness was both with boycotts and with targeting some specific companies. That again was it wasn't shareholder activism per se at that point, but it was socially responsible activism. Vietnam was going on. There were many protests that were occurring out of the Vietnamese situation related to napalm and other kinds of things, and companies specifically began to be targeted at that point. And as you heard Terry mention, there was a shareholder focus around Vietnam with some of the investments that were being made. 3 Mile Island, for those of you who can remember, that nuclear leakage occurred during the 60s and the 70s. And again, shareholder protest as well as public protest occurred related to those actions. Those were largely targeted at the power industry. Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred during that time. And again, shareholders and the public at large began to focus against the oil industry and others, and also focus on the regulatory authorities in this country and their failure of oversight. I raised those things to get us to where we are today, in part because it is not just shareholder activism that operates in a vacuum, but in fact it is together with the other activism that is the public activism. The 1970s launched the large institutional shareholder activism that Peter has spoken about. And ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, was part of that effort. It arose in 1971 after Reverend Leon Sullivan, was selected by the board of General Motors to be a member of the board because they were under other pressures around integrating their board. Little did they know that he would begin to zero in on the South Africa situation, and in the process created what is now known as the Sullivan Principles, which govern the behavior of, or set a standard of behavior for corporations in South Africa and otherwise. Out of that movement against GM in 1971, ICCR was formed as an effort of bringing together those faith-based members that Peter has already talked about, whose investment as institutional investors could be combined to bring extra and exert extra pressure and force against the South African apartheid situation. And as we all know, it went on a long time beyond that, but the wheels started to come off gradually, and this was part of that effort. So today we have socially responsible activism and shareholder activism continuing in a lot of different ways now, because all these forces are coming together from the investor side, demanding that investors are demanding that they have places to invest that are socially responsible. And you've heard about the number of funds. There's probably 200 plus of all the funds that are out there now that are socially responsible. And at the same time, shareholder activism has emerged through ICCR and others, where the proxy vote, as shareholders, you go in and you take issue with something that a company is irresponsible about in terms of social responsibility and ESG, and you use the strength of being a shareholder and the moral authority of what is right, again, goodness being the only investment that never fails. How do you argue against that, especially when there's collars and nuns sitting out in the room? It makes it very difficult. And so it is alive and well, and there are a number of organizations working collaboratively with ICCR. I won't go through the whole litany, but you should become familiar with Ceres if you're not, with SIF. You should certainly know about the United Nations. I'll stop there rather than name others. So that shareholder activism element is very important to the foundation of this overall movement. The two reinforce one another, the investor side of things about responsible funds and investments, and once the investments have been made, making sure that the companies where you have invested still match up to what your values are.
Thanks, Casey. Cary, can you give us an overview of where we stand on performance?
Thanks. Let's try that one. Thanks, Anders. For our book, we did a study, and there were actually 850 global socially responsible funds a few years ago. I don't know if that number has increased, but so that would include a wide variety of investment strategies. And one of the things we talk about in the book is that there are actually 11 different strands of socially responsible investing, or sustainable investing, call it what you will. They include engagement, which we've heard about, and it also includes a lot of different strategies, and they actually behave differently depending on the particular focus. So you might take a benchmark like the S&P 500 and subtract out alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. That might be something you call negative screening. What we actually did was we looked for funds that focused on the opportunities coming from things like the fact that, I'd just like to ask a question. Does anyone in this room think that business as usual is anything but unsustainable? Raise your hand if you... Okay, there were a couple of hands, but anyway. Maybe that was a double negative, but at any rate, we're entering a world of constrained resources, population growth that will be unsupportable, lack of fresh water in the developing world, ecosystems that are deteriorating. These things eventually will manifest themselves into issues of materiality. And so, we thought it would be best to look at funds that are looking for the opportunities coming from this, not just to mitigate the risk, to do both at the same time. Amongst that universe, we found 130 or so funds that had been around for 5 years that had at least 100 million US dollars in equity. And what we found was, looking at the 1, 3, and 5 years leading up to the end of 2007, basically before the financial crisis, that those funds had consistently outperformed the mainstream. We then looked again for a paper we did for the UN PRI Academic Network Conference in Ottawa a few months ago, and we found that, again, over a 5-year period, those funds have been outperforming, and for the first half of this year as well. So pre-crisis, through the crisis, and afterwards as well. This is a strategy that's already been working. There have been a number of studies that have correlated this finding, that there's outperformance on a as long as you can go back. And one key thing to say is that this is a fairly recent type of investing, looking for these opportunities. It's only a generation ago that the Brundtland Commission, thank you, Terry, the Brundtland Commission defined sustainability as meeting the needs of today without jeopardizing the needs of tomorrow. And investing has only really started focusing on that. And the definition of sustainability is one we could probably talk for 2 hours about alone. My definition of sustainability incorporates mainstream financial criteria. I would argue that GM was not a sustainable company simply on its business model, going back a few years. So the definition of sustainability is very important to factor in. But the bottom line is that performance studies are showing outperformance for these strategies, and firms like Calvert are first movers, are adapting, and they're seeing that their funds are mindful of the carbon price that's looming upon us. We're doing a piece of work with them that's very exciting. We've done work with KLD. We did the green rankings you may have seen in Newsweek. That was a fantastic project that we're very proud of collectively as of the first ever real analysis that made some sense when you looked at the results. So we're very excited about that. And we also partner with ICCR at Trucost and provide them with information on the environmental aspects, and there'll be a 2.0 of that, I'm sure, coming next year. So we all work together up here, and I think that was actually a coincidence, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, I just wanted to give you that perspective that these strategies actually are already outperforming, and I think every strategy of SRI has been outperforming this year. Community investing was the outperforming strategy of 2008. And so the question ultimately becomes, in a world of constrained resources, will the definition of fiduciary duty change? Will it become against fiduciary duty not to factor things that are bound to become material?
Thanks a lot, Cary. I'd like to stay with performance for a minute. Peter, you built an index many years ago and have, these questions have been core to the research that you've done at KLD for years. What are you seeing on the performance side, and how is it changing?
Well, I'm going to leave the numbers to Cary because that was his division of labor, Cary. What we're seeing on the performance side is a split. There are, now that institutions have discovered socially responsible investing, which is now called either sustainability investing, ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, or some other name that does not imply a value judgment. Now that they have discovered this, they're very interested in how these issues affect performance. So we're seeing a great deal of interest in lists and in rankings and ratings. That doesn't remove something that I think is critically important in the discussion of performance, and that is that the standards to which corporations have been held in these social areas has evolved dramatically since 1971, since the first real foray by ICCR in this field, almost unrecognizably. The degree of sophistication that's being brought to the environmental rankings is only the most obvious. So we're looking at corporations and their relationship to society much differently than we did 40 years ago. We're bringing a level of sophistication, a level of understanding, and that level is not one way. Corporations are responding to this. Corporations are responding. This is, to use that wonderful German word, this is the zeitgeist. This is the spirit of the age. Corporations are changing, investors are changing, the criteria are changing. In other words, all the rules are changing. They're not static.